It's a beautiful spring day in late February. We're here with Maggie at Lake Lagunitas in Fairfax. It's a perfect temperature outside, and emerald green is everywhere. We have a necklace of butterflies floating around us. Now, Maggie has spent over 12 years as a voice for animals, caring for injured and abandoned wildlife, advocating for humane treatment of all animals, and working as a tireless volunteer for wild care. Maggie, hi.
Hi.
So, what first inspired you to get involved with nature education and wildlife rehabilitation, with wild care in particular?
Well, I moved to Northern California in 1995 from Philadelphia, where there's not a whole lot of wildlife. And I had always loved animals, and I was just really looking for connections. And I saw an ad in the paper, and it said, "Do you love wildlife?" And I said, "Yes, I do." So I called the number, and that was Wild Care, and that's how I first went there. And from the moment I went there, I was just so excited because it was like finding all these other people that were like me, and finding out that I wasn't so weird after all, with all the feelings of compassion and sensitivity I had towards animals. So it gave me a place in the world.
Now, this story that we have here about coyotes, can you talk a little bit about maybe ways in which we can coexist with wildlife, maybe do a little better job of it?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is just having more respect for wildlife and more awareness of wildlife when we're doing things. For example, people get really excited about seeing wildlife, and then sometimes they kind of try to force that, maybe by feeding the wildlife. There's a situation I've been involved with where people are doing that with coyotes, and they want to get these cool pictures of coyotes up close to them. And so they began feeding coyotes by throwing food out of their car windows, so that the coyote has become habituated to people. But if you feed wildlife, after a while the wildlife starts expecting to be fed, and it can get quite demanding. And the wild animals will start approaching other people who might not necessarily want to feed them or want them to come that close. And then if those people start complaining to, say, the park rangers or the park administrators about this aggressive wildlife situation, which may or may not be of any danger to them, but they're just nervous about it, immediately that animal's life becomes endangered. The park is there for people, and there's liability issues, and it's just not natural for wildlife to approach people. If you love wildlife, wait for the magic opportunities when you have that encounter with wildlife that you might have. Not try to create an unnatural situation that ends up actually harming this wildlife that you wanted to connect with.
Yeah, I imagine too, if you're throwing food out of cars, that's actually calling the animals into the road, and they could be hit by cars. Is that right?
Yes, that's already happened in this particular park. A coyote has been hit by a car, and coyotes are seen sitting in the road all the time. And cars hits are a big cause of injury to animals like coyotes and bobcats and foxes. So, yeah, it's very bad for coyotes to become comfortable around roads or cars. Because of Wild Care, and particularly one volunteer at Wild Care who took this cause to heart when she realized how the park was possibly deeming it necessary to exterminate the coyotes that were getting too familiar with people. She just took the lead, and there's a whole team of people now that are trying to undo this damage that has been done to the coyotes. It's not the coyotes that have bad behavior, it's the human behavior.
That's not a coyote, that's my dog.
But we're trying really, really hard to save these coyotes and to get them to go back to being wild so that they're not killed, either deliberately or accidentally by cars.
Thank you, Maggie. That's really important work. As we encroach on the wild territories, we need to find more ways that we can live really peacefully and intelligently with wildlife. I think all of our listeners want to thank you for going out there and doing what you can to wild the coyotes back up again so that we can coexist in a community in a respectful way, and everyone can be safe, and we can all be much, much better neighbors. Maggie, we've talked a little bit about community at Wild Care. I bet you have a story that comes to mind that could maybe help us understand what it feels like to be a volunteer at a wildlife hospital or a nature education center.
Well, the first thing I would want to say is that I know there are some people listening to this and people that I've talked to that think that wildlife rehabilitation is actually interfering with nature because we're nursing these animals back to health. But one of the first things I learned at WildCare is that almost every animal that comes into WildCare is there because of something humans did. It's not injured by natural causes. I think most of the natural causes of injury to wildlife, we probably never see that wildlife. It just deals with it out in the wild. But most of the animals that come in is because of humans. And one of the big ones is every spring we all get spring fever and the spring cleaning bug, and we start chopping things down in our yard, cutting down trees, pruning trees. And this is actually the worst possible time of year that we could do this because spring is baby season for all of our wildlife. I've had quite a few experiences through a program I help run at WildCare called the Hungry Owl Project, where nests have been disturbed or cut down that contain baby birds of prey like hawks and owls. And one story in particular was of a huge oak tree. The homeowner hadn't been living there very long, but one of the reasons why they bought the house was because they fell in love with this beautiful old, maybe 100-year-old oak tree that was just stunning. Not long after they moved in, they found out from the neighbors that barn owls had been living in this tree for many years. They had come back every year to nest in the tree. And barn owls are extremely beneficial animals for humans because they eat so many rodents. After they learned that, they also learned that their beloved tree was actually dying inside, and there was a serious danger that it was going to actually fall on their house. And so it was determined that this tree needed to be cut down. Because they knew the barn owls lived in the tree, the developer of a newly developed neighborhood hired a biologist to monitor the situation and to give the okay. When can we cut this tree down without endangering a nest of barn owls, which would actually be against the law, because they're a protected species under the Federal Migratory Bird Act. The biologist came in, and biologist is a very broad term, and it doesn't necessarily mean you know everything about everything. And the biologist did give the okay to start taking the tree down. What they do with a big tree is they limb it first. They cut all the major limbs off the tree until there's just all that's left is this really high trunk of the tree. So that's what they did. And when the tree trimmer went up to the top of this trunk to start cutting the trunk down, at the very top there was a big opening, and down inside was a mother barn owl on her eggs.
Oh, wow.
So the biologist had made a mistake when she gave the okay. Unfortunately, it took them quite a while to call the right people, which was WildCare, and then WildCare called myself and Alex, who directs the Hungry Owl Project, and we raced over there. First thing the biologist had suggested was that they go in and take the owl out of the tree and the eggs and send the eggs to a wildlife center to be incubated, and that she was going to get a permit from Fish and Game to do that, and we immediately knew that that was not the right thing to do and that wouldn't work. And actually, luckily for us, the barn owl nest was 4 feet down inside this tree, and there was no way to get to her. So with the homeowner and the builder and the biologist, we negotiated a solution, which was that now that all the limbs were off the tree was not a danger. The owl would be left alone, the tree would be left as it was until these babies had hatched and had fledged. The homeowners made a big sign and hung it on their fence to tell the whole neighborhood what was going on. And meanwhile, all the neighbors were watching, and they knew when the baby owls fledged out of the tree, and they were updating us constantly. So she sent our volunteer tree climber up on this specific date. So she did leave the tree when the tree climber went up there, and the tree was sealed. And in the meantime, we got the builder to put up one of our barn owl boxes on a pole very close to the tree to give them a new home. And the best part of the whole story is that the very next year they did come back and they moved into the owl box to the delight of the homeowners and everyone in the neighborhood. The homeowners even called the owls Barney and Betty, and they were so excited when they contacted us to tell us they were back.
And so the whole community is just anticipates it every year.
Yeah, and this happens over and over again when we do these nest returns, we call them, where we restore the juveniles back to their family where they belong.
So it's a really good feeling when you know you've really done not only the right thing, but you've done something that really matters a lot to the animals. And you've also done something that has brought the animals together with the people into a larger community.
Yeah, it gives us just this opportunity to educate. And then we start talking to them about, hey, you have these barn owls in your neighborhood, or you have these hawks in your neighborhood. You have to be really careful not to use rat poison outside your house so that they don't get poisoned from eating poisoned rats. So it just opens up this whole channel of communication.
Well, that brings me to this last question, which is, if there's one thing that you could tell listeners that they could do to help wildlife survive in our changing world, what would be that one thing that comes to your mind?
Individually is opening your mind and opening your heart so that your heart is big enough to have compassion for not only humans but also animals, and becoming aware of what's around you and being careful within your own little footprint that you occupy on the planet, living in harmony with them, not feeding wildlife, not cutting trees down at the wrong time of year, checking for nests, being tolerant, consuming less resources. I mean, there's so many things, and just getting involved with a group like Wildcare, because every life that you get involved with, that makes a difference.
Everyone is an individual and certainly
Sure.
worthy of our care and our awareness and
Yeah.
our support.
Yeah.
Maggie, thank you so much for being here with us today
You're welcome.
among the butterflies.
Thanks for having me.
Discover your place among the wild things. Visit Wildcare online at wildcarebayarea.org. Experience, explore, connect. I'm Gina Farr. Thanks for listening. This conversation is a feature of wildsoundstories.com.